The wind howled like a wounded beast across the frontier town, rattling loose shutters and making lanterns flicker until they threatened to go dark. Inside the cookhouse on the edge of Main Street, Clara Jameson pressed dough flat on a wooden counter dusted with flour. The night was long, and though the storm had driven away her usual late patrons, she stayed busy, because hands that worked stayed steady. The fire hissed low in the stove, the only warmth against the wet chill creeping through every crack in the boards. She paused, wiping her brow with her sleeve. Her hair, once thick and dark, now streaked with gray, clung damp to her temples. She muttered to herself just to hear a voice above the storm. That was when it came, a pounding on the door, sudden and furious, shaking the frame so hard her skillet rattled on its hook. Her heart lurched. In a place like this, midnight knocks carried only bad news. She grabbed the skillet from the wall, the iron heavy in her hand, and stepped toward the door. "Open up, Clara, ain't safe tonight," came the voice through the rain. Rough, familiar, dangerous. Clara's stomach dropped. She'd heard that voice before. Whispered in saloons, cursed in church steps, murmured in caution around supper tables. Elias Kane. Her fingers fumbled with the latch before she forced herself to stillness. "What have you done?" she whispered to the empty room. When she pulled open the door, a rush of wind and rain burst in. A man leaned heavy against the frame, hat dripping, coat plastered to his body. His left shoulder was slick with blood, the dark stain spreading down his sleeve. His eyes, sharp and pale under the brim, flickered with defiance even as his body sagged. "Help me in," he muttered, voice low, before he stumbled forward, collapsing near the stove. Clara slammed the door against the storm, her chest pounding. She stared at the figure crumpled on her floor. He was everything she should fear. Gun at his hip, hands stained with violence, a man who carried his reputation like a warning sign. Yet the storm outside roared so fiercely it seemed the world itself wanted him gone. She crouched by him, skillet still clutched in her hand. "You brought trouble here, didn't you?" Kane gave a strained laugh, teeth clenched as pain ripped through him. "Trouble's been following me long before your doorstep." Clara dropped the skillet, grabbing a rag from the counter. Against her better judgment, her hands moved with practiced steadiness, pressing cloth to the wound at his shoulder. He winced but didn't cry out. "You could have died in the street," she muttered. "Maybe I still will," he rasped, shutting his eyes. Thunder shook the earth, rattling the stove door. Then came another sound, hoofbeats heavy and fast, splashing through mud outside. Clara froze, blood roaring in her ears. Riders were sweeping the town, searching. She moved to the window, parting the curtain with trembling fingers. Lanterns swung in the rain as mounted men patrolled, iron stars gleaming on their chests. The sheriff's men. Her heart pounded harder. They'd see the trail of blood at her steps, the lamplight still burning inside. If they found him here, they'd mark her guilty too. Widow or not, cook or not, it wouldn't matter. Behind her, Kane stirred. "Don't let him in," he murmured. Clara turned on him sharply. "Don't tell me what to do in my own house," but her words shook. She knew what harboring him meant. Already the law had taken enough from her. Her husband buried years too soon under railroad timbers no one claimed responsibility for. Sheriff Doolin's men called it accident. Clara called it murder by neglect. And now here was this outlaw bleeding on her floor, daring her to lie to the law once more. The hoofbeats slowed outside her door. Lantern light cut through the slats of the shutters. Clara's breath caught as a shape drew close, the gleam of metal pressing against the glass. An iron star, a deputy's voice rose through the storm, sharp as a blade. "Clara, you alone in there?" Her grip tightened on the blood-stained cloth in her hand. The room seemed to close in around her, the storm and the law pressing hard against her walls. Behind her, Kane's pale eyes opened again, watching, waiting, and in that moment, "Clara." Jameson realized she had only seconds to decide which noose she would place around her neck, truth or silence. The first light of morning crept pale and uncertain through the warped boards of the cookhouse. Clara Jameson sat on a low stool beside the stove, her sleeves rolled, her hands pressed hard against the rag that bound Elias Kane's shoulder. The night storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and wet. But the man on her floor still breathed like thunder lived inside him. If this story has gripped you so far, hit that like button and drop a comment. Would you have hidden Kane or turned him in? And don't forget to subscribe for more Western tales like this. His pale eyes cracked open as the dawn widened across the room. He studied her, lips dry, words dragging out with the faintest rasp. Gentle hands, Clara's jaw tightened. Don't mistake mercy for trust. She twisted the cloth tighter, drawing a groan from him. Blood had seeped through, sticky and dark, but the bleeding slowed under her work. He chuckled low, pain wrapped in smoke. Not many would help a man like me. She glanced at him, then looked away. Not many have had the law at their door in the middle of the night. You've cursed me with that. Kane turned his head, catching her expression in the slanting morning light. He saw it. The lines carved deeper by grief than age, the hollow strength of a woman who had lost more than she let on. You got no love for the law, he muttered. I saw it in your face last night. Clara leaned back, wiping her hands on her apron. For a moment she said nothing. The stove hissed, the fire settling into ash. Then, with a voice scraped thin by memory, she answered. My husband worked rail for near a decade. Died under a pile of timber that never should have been set loose. Sheriff's men called it accident. I called it murder, paid for by profit and silence. They buried him quick along with the truth. Kane's eyes narrowed. A shadow of recognition flickered as if her pain rhymed with his own. He gave a crooked smile, sharp but not cruel. So you ain't all apron and prayer after all. Her glare shot back. You think you know me, but you don't. I keep this cookhouse clean. I keep myself alive. That's all. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of wagons rolling past outside. But Clara could hear it. The low murmur of voices carried on the street. Townsfolk gathering early, trading whispers sharper than any knife. She knew what they said. Shadows in her window, lawman at her door, a widow who didn't answer quick enough. Kane shifted, wincing as he tried to sit straighter. They'll be talking plenty more before the day is done. If you don't lie for me, they'll hang me. If you do, they'll come for you too. She met his gaze, steady now. And what makes you worth the risk? He didn't answer. His silence was heavier than words. Outside, the murmur swelled, boots scuffing dirt, the creak of leather belts and gun holsters settling in place. Clara's throat went dry. She rose and moved to the window, heart hammering at the sight. The townsfolk had lingered, watching her door, eyes narrowed with suspicion. And cutting through them like a blade came Sheriff Doolin himself, his wide frame blocking the light, spurs crunching with each deliberate step toward her cookhouse. He stopped at her door, one hand resting on the butt of his revolver, the other curling into a fist against the wood. The sound was steady, unhurried, a knock that carried no request, only command. Clara, the sheriff's voice rumbled, low and certain. Open this door. We need to talk. Her hand hovered above the latch, her heart pulled between silence and betrayal. Behind her, Kane's pale eyes fixed on her, waiting to see which life she would condemn. Sheriff Doolin stepped through the doorway without waiting for invitation, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat, spurs biting into the silence with every step. His broad shoulders filled the room, and though his boots were caked in mud, he didn't pause to scrape them clean. Clara Jameson stood stiff behind the counter, one hand resting on the edge as if bracing herself against the weight of the moment. His eyes swept the cookhouse slowly, pausing on the stove, the damp rag folded beside it, the floorboards that groaned under his heel. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight in his tone was enough. Fugitive passed this way. You see anything? Clara felt her throat tighten. Just beneath her feet, under the very boards on which Doolin stood, Elias Kane crouched in the darkness of the root cellar, silent as stone, listening to every word. The smell of damp earth rose faintly through the cracks, mingling with the bitter tang of coffee grounds. Clara forced her hands steady, though the tremor in them betrayed her. I heard the storm, she muttered, reaching for the tin pot on the stove, kept me blind to anything else. She poured coffee into a chipped mug, the liquid sloshing against the rim, her hand trembling as she pushed it across the table. You want a cup, Sheriff? Doolin didn't touch it. His gaze stayed fixed on her, sharp as a knife. He stepped closer, leaning his weight against the counter, the leather of his coat creaking. Your husband trusted the law, Clara. You should too. The name, the memory cut her deeper than his tone. Her jaw clenched. My husband died because of the law. A silence stretched, long enough for the stove's fire to crackle and shift. Doolin's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth twitching as if holding back anger or amusement. Careful, he said softly. The words you speak might carry you to places you don't want to go. Clara lifted her chin, though her hands shook against her apron. The places I've already been can't be worse. He studied her, long and cold. Then in a sudden shift his voice hardened, every syllable sharp as spurs striking stone. "You'll choose the law, Clara, or you'll be against it." Beneath the floorboards, Kane's hand rested on the revolver at his side. He could almost hear her heartbeat pounding above him, knew she stood at the edge of a cliff and any word could tip her over. Doolin straightened, glancing once more around the room. His eyes lingered on the shadows at the back wall, the faint smear of mud near the door, the rag still damp with blood. Clara's chest tightened as she saw his hand hover near his holster, thumb brushing against the worn handle. Before he could speak again, the door banged open. A deputy staggered in, breathless, rain still running down his cheeks. In his fist he held a crumpled piece of cloth dark and stiff with dried blood. "Sheriff," the deputy said, thrusting it forward. "Found this near the widow's porch." The bandana dangled from his hand, unmistakable in its color and stain. Clara's breath caught, her eyes darting to it before she could stop herself. Sheriff Doolin's gaze followed hers, slow and deliberate. He reached out, taking the bandana, turning it over in his gloved hand. The room seemed to shrink around Clara, the storm outside silenced by the pounding in her ears. Doolin's eyes lifted, meeting hers with cold certainty. "Looks like the storm didn't blind you as much as you claimed." Beneath the floor, Kane's jaw tightened. His cover was crumbling and Clara's lie was seconds from collapse. Clara's fingers clenched tight around her apron as the bloodied bandana hung in the sheriff's hand like a verdict already passed. She steadied her breath and forced her voice into the narrow space between them. "Plenty of men wear red. Storm could have carried it from anywhere. That rag proves nothing." For a long moment Doolin said nothing, only studied her as if he were measuring the truth inside her bones. The stove crackled. Rainwater dripped from his coat onto the floorboards. Finally, he tucked the cloth into his pocket. "Maybe it proves nothing," he said slowly. "But I know a lie when it sits across from me. I'll be back, Clara, and next time I'll expect better answers." His boot struck the floor with sharp, deliberate steps as he left, the deputy trailing after him. The door swung shut and the silence that followed was heavier than the storm had been. Clara's knees nearly gave, but she forced herself to stand tall until the sound of spurs faded down the street. The trapdoor creaked open, and Kane pulled himself from the cellar, his face pale but his eyes burning. He looked at her like a man surprised and unsettled by the choice she had made. "You lied for me." She turned on him, jaw set, though her hands still shook. "Don't flatter yourself." "I lied for me. I won't hand another soul to the law, not after what they've taken already." Kane's smirk was faint, almost grim. That's reason enough, but Clara could feel the crack inside herself widening. She had crossed a line, and once crossed, it never vanished. By noon, the whispers had already spread. Patrons who once filled her tables with laughter and clatter now lingered only long enough to eat in silence, eyes cutting toward her corners, toward the shadows where a man might hide. Some stopped coming altogether. The cookhouse, once warm with company, grew thin with suspicion. Every coin dropped on her counter felt like payment made reluctantly, as if guilt came with every meal. Kane watched it all from the edges of her life, a shadow in her doorway, a quiet presence near the stove. One afternoon he stepped outside without a word, split an old stump and began chopping wood with slow, steady swings. Clara stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Don't play at decency now. It doesn't suit you." He didn't answer, only drove the axe down again, wood splitting clean, the rhythm oddly comforting despite her words. Then, as dusk fell, the sound of a single horse carried over the prairie. Clara's heart quickened as she saw a rider approaching fast, dust rising behind him. The man swung down, breathless, and slapped a sheet of paper against her doorframe. Ink glistened in the fading light. The sketch was crude but clear. Elias Kane's face, hard-lined, unmistakable. Beneath it, the reward spelled out in bold strokes, more money than most of her neighbors would see in years. The paper flapped in the wind, and the air between them grew colder. Every man and woman in town would know by morning. Kane was no longer a shadow hidden in her house. He was a price on her head as well. The paper still clung to her doorframe when Clara tore it down, her hands trembling as the crude sketch of Elias Kane stared back at her in ink. The words beneath it were heavier than the storm had been the night before, reward enough to set half the county on her doorstep, hungry for blood and coin. She turned, slamming the poster down on the table between them. "They'll come for you," she hissed. "Maybe I should let them." Kane sat at the edge of the stove's light, his broad shoulders bent, the fire painting his pale eyes in shifting glow. He didn't flinch at her words. He didn't reach for the poster. He only leaned back, silent for a long moment before speaking low. "I won't lie. I've killed." Clara's chest tightened, the air rushing shallow in her lungs. "But not like they're saying," Kane went on. "The man I put in the ground wasn't innocent. He was Doolin's kin, his cousin. A thief who tried to burn families out of their land. Homesteaders with nothing but plows and children. I stopped him the only way a man like that can be stopped." His voice cracked faintly, but his stare never wavered. Clara's fingers gripped the edge of the poster, crumpling the paper until it tore. Her mind reeled. If it was true, then Sheriff Doolin's badge didn't shine with justice, but with blood and kinship twisted for profit. She whispered, more to herself than to him. "All these years, I thought the law was careless. Maybe it's rotten through." Kane let out a humorless laugh. "Rot runs deeper than folks care to admit." She looked at him hard, anger rising as fear pressed in. "If I hide you, I risk my life. If I hand you over, I damn my soul." Kane didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just lowered his hat brim until the shadow cut across his face, his silence heavy, daring her to decide what kind of woman she was. The room was so still Clara could hear the pop of resin in the burning wood. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. The choice clawed at her, safety or conscience, survival or something deeper. For years she had kept her head low, kept to her kitchen, lived quiet, but the law had already stolen her husband, stolen her faith, and now it wanted her silence again. Her hand dropped from the torn poster, falling useless at her side. Kane's pale eyes flicked toward her, unreadable. If you believe Clara's courage changed the whole town, show your support with a like. Comment below. Should Kane have stayed, or was leaving the right choice? And subscribe to catch the next Western drama. Then the sound came, sharp and sudden. The thud of nails hammered into wood. Clara jerked toward the door. She moved to the window, pulling back the curtain with shaking fingers. Townsfolk stood outside, their faces hard, their eyes glinting with the fever of fear and greed. One man pressed another notice against her door, hammer driving the truth home with each blow. She opened the door just enough to see it. The words carved in thick black letters. Harboring a fugitive is death by rope. The hammer struck again, loud as a gunshot, sealing the warning to her walls. Clara froze, the paper shaking in the wind, the crowd's murmurs rising like a storm waiting to break. Behind her, Kane's voice cut through, steady and grave. "Now they'll come for both of us." Clara climbed the chair like it was a gallows step, the room a hush of embers and breath. The crowd outside had drifted for now, but the warning nailed to her door still trembled with every stray gust. She pressed her palms to the rafters and felt along the beam worn smooth by years of smoke. Splinters bit her fingertips. Something shifted inside the wood, a thin, dry scratch. She pried at a loose board, teeth gritted, and a narrow bundle slid free, wrapped in oilcloth stained brown with old hands and older dust. She stared at it a long moment before she dared to open it. Elias watched from the table's edge, hat low, shoulder freshly bound. He didn't speak. When the oilcloth unfurled, the smell of cedar and sweat rose like a memory. A small leather journal lay inside, its tie frayed, its cover marked with her husband's name in a careful hand that still steadied her to see. Under it, folded papers with survey stamps and crooked signatures waited like snakes. Her fingers shook the first time she lifted the journal. The second time they steadied. She untied the strap and the old world creaked open. Ink marched in neat lines. Notes of grades and timbers, schedules and crews, dates of deliveries that came late and bribes that arrived early. A name appeared again and again like a nail hammered through the spine. Doolin. Sheriff's approval on lumber cut too thin. Sheriff's blessing on bridge footings poured in winter water that would crack when the thaw came. Sheriff's signature beside a land office seal pushed forward a week, just enough for a cousin to win a parcel nobody knew was about to be seized. Clara swallowed, the room tilting. She found a page halfway through where the writing broke, a splatter where the pen dug hard. Accident waiting, her husband had written. Rails laid hungry. If I refuse, they replace me. If I sign, it's my ghost that swings. And below, written lighter as if he feared the words themselves, Doolin promised a cut if I shut my mouth. She pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes. When she blinked, everything looked sharpened, stripped of softness. She turned to the folded papers. Survey maps with boundary lines redrawn in a different ink, crooked but confident. Bills of lading that listed one grade of timber and delivered another. A receipt stamped with the land office seal, and beside it, a scar of a signature that matched the sheriff's more than the clerk's. And at the bottom, the smallest slip, a note from the cousin, promising collection if a family refused to move, initialed with the same hand Kane had described. "That's your noose," Elias said quietly. "Or your weapon." She looked at him and he didn't look away. The pale in his eyes was steady, almost calm now that the truth had weight. She shut the journal and retied the strap like she was binding a wound. "If I keep this hidden, he owns every breath in this town," she said. "If I show it, I might not live long enough to see them believe." "People know the stink of rot," Elias said. "They just need to see the flies." Clara slid the journal beneath her apron, pressing it to her ribs. The papers she folded once more and tucked under the counter stone where the floor ran cool. Her husband's hand was warm in her mind, guiding her toward the thing he hadn't had the courage or time to do. She straightened, chin set. "We take it to him," she said. "Not in a back room. In the square, in front of the ones he thinks he owns." Elias rose, the movement drawing a grunt through his teeth. "Then let's end it where all his lies echo." A sound swelled outside, low as a hive at first, then sharper. Voices braided with anger. Boots scuffed. Wood knocked wood. She blew out the lamps and the room slid into ember-red gloom. Through the window slit, she saw light bloom along the street. Torches flaring one by one, flames licking up with the greedy look of a crowd that had found permission. Shadows leapt high against the clapboard fronts long as ropes. Men gathered, faces hard, a coil hanging from one gloved fist, then another. The iron star of a deputy gleamed in the firelight. "Clara Jameson!" someone shouted, voice full of heat and certainty. "Come out." The rope bit into her wrists as rough hands shoved her forward through the night. Torches blazing on either side like angry suns. Clara stumbled, boots dragging across mud and gravel, the mob's voices rising in ugly chorus. Beside her, Elias Kane was hauled by two men, his face pale under the firelight, his shoulder wound seeping through the bandage. He didn't resist. His silence was a different kind of defiance. They drove them into the town square where shadows loomed high against the clapboard walls and every eye burned with suspicion. Sheriff Doolin stood at the center, tall and broad, his badge catching the firelight. His hand rested easy on the butt of his revolver. His mouth curled in a grim smile. "Here they are," he called, voice carrying like a preacher's. "The murderer, and the woman fool enough to shield him." The crowd jeered, spitting at the ground. Torches wavered as men stepped closer, the noose swinging from the gallows beam already waiting. Doolin's deputies shoved Kane toward it. Clara felt her chest tighten as she was dragged to stand beside him. "Elias Kane shot my cousin in cold blood," Doolin declared. "And this woman, Clara Jameson, betrayed her own people to harbor him. Justice is clear. The rope will answer for us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The hangman's knot scraped against wood as it was lowered. Clara's knees weakened. She thought of her husband buried under broken timbers, of the silence she had endured since, and of the journal tied beneath her apron, its weight like a living thing. When the noose brushed Kane's shoulder, Clara's voice broke free. "Stop!" she cried so sharp it cut the crowd's noise in half. She fumbled with the apron ties, her hands trembling as she pulled the journal free. "You want truth? Then hear it." The square went still. Torches hissed in the wind. She opened the book, her voice shaking but loud enough to carry. This was my husband's hand. He wrote of the railroad timbers, of the bribes, of the false signatures. Sheriff Doolin signed off on faulty work. He stole land with lies, and he killed my husband as sure as if he'd pulled the trigger. Gasps tore through the mob. Faces turned, uneasy, searching each other's eyes. "You all lost something when the rails came," Clara pressed on, her voice rising with each word. "Homes seized. Families pushed off their land. Doolin profited from every bit of it." Her hand shook the pages. "My husband tried to warn you. They buried him for it." Kane's voice cut in then, low but carrying, rough with defiance. "Ask yourselves, who profits from our silence? Whose pockets grow heavier every time you bow your heads?" The firelight caught the sheriff's face, and for the first time it wasn't confidence that shone there, but fury. Doolin lunged forward, reaching for the journal, but Kane stepped into his path despite the rope at his neck. The two men collided, the crowd gasping, the journal clutched high in Clara's hands. Lies, Doolin barked. She's spinning lies to save a killer. But the weight of doubt had already settled. A torch lowered, then another. The air shifted, no longer unified rage but restless uncertainty. And then from the line of deputies, one man stepped forward. His face pale, his eyes darting, his hand trembling as it reached for the badge pinned to his chest. For a moment he froze, the whole town watching. Then with a sharp motion he tore the star free and flung it at Doolin's feet. The metal clanged against the boards, louder than a gunshot. The crowd fell silent. Clara clutched the journal tight against her chest, Kane breathing hard at her side, the noose swaying above them like a shadow waiting its turn. Sheriff Doolin's eyes narrowed to slits, his hand sliding toward his gun. The night held its breath, balanced on the edge of a reckoning. The square erupted into shouts and the stamp of boots, torches wavering as if the fire itself feared the moment. Sheriff Doolin's hand shot to his revolver and the blast split the night. A crack so loud it drowned the voices and sent smoke curling over the crowd. The bullet tore harmless into the sky, but the threat was clear: silence or die. Men and women flinched, torches sagging, the hiss of fear rushing through them. Elias Kane stood at the rope's edge, chest heaving, pale eyes locked on Doolin. His hand hovered near his own gun, though blood still seeped beneath his coat where wounds had barely begun to knit. The firelight caught the steel, both men poised, both statues carved from rage and defiance. "You hand him over now," Doolin bellowed, his voice grinding with the force of command. "Or every one of you burns with him." Clara's throat burned raw, but she forced her voice to rise above the torches and the guns. "If you kill him, you prove me right." The crowd turned at her cry. Her face glistened with sweat and smoke, her hands trembling but her eyes fierce. She clutched the journal, the one thing more dangerous than any gun, high against her chest. Kane's voice followed hers, sharp as a blade drawn. "Ask yourselves, who profits from your silence? Who takes your land, your kin, your sweat, and calls it law?" The mob wavered, mutters running through the ranks. Some lowered their torches, others looked away, shame creeping over the fever of their fear. But Doolin's face twisted, the calm of his badge stripped bare, fury contorting his jaw. He lunged for Clara, the revolver still smoking in his grip. Kane stepped between them. Their guns flashed almost in unison, thunder in the torchlight. The smell of powder choked the square, torches flaring wild in the gust of violence. Clara flinched as fire spat into the night, her ears ringing with the sound. Then silence. Smoke drifted like ghosts across the square. The crowd held still, breath suspended in the crackle of flames. When it cleared, Elias Kane stood, swaying, blood running fresh from a line across his ribs. His gun hung heavy at his side, smoking barrel pointed to the ground. At his feet lay Sheriff Doolin, sprawled in the dirt, eyes wide to the heavens that would not answer him. The torches hissed in the night air, and the silence that followed was heavier than all the shouting that had come before. Every face turned to Clara, waiting, unsure whether to fear her or follow her. She stepped forward, knees shaking, and raised the journal high above her head. Her voice rang out, ragged but sure. "This ends here. Truth, not fear, rules us now. For a heartbeat, nothing." Then the weight broke. Men lowered their torches, women pulled shawls tight, and the first few turned away. One by one, the crowd thinned, dispersing into shadows, leaving behind only the hiss of torches left in the dirt. The square emptied until only Clara and Kane remained in the glow. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his side where the blood spread warm and stubborn. His lips curled faint, half a smile even in pain. "Guess you ain't just gentle." Her throat tightened, but she held his hand firm, eyes steady on his pale ones. "Guess you ain't just wild." The fire burned lower, torches guttering to embers, the night at last easing into quiet. Beyond the rooftops, the first gray hint of dawn stretched thin against the horizon. The town would wake to a world forever changed, its lawman gone, its truth laid bare. And as the cold light of morning touched the square, Clara Jameson and Elias Kane sat together in the dirt, bound by blood, choice, and a fight neither had wanted, but both had survived. Dawn broke, and with it the weight of silence lifted. The mornings had grown quiet again, the kind of quiet that spoke of work and not of fear. Weeks had passed since the square filled with fire and shouting, since Sheriff Doolin's body hit the dirt and the truth spilled wider than any blood. The town had shifted, not overnight, not clean, but steady. Folks still whispered when Clara Jameson passed, but the tones were different now. Less suspicion, more something like respect. Or maybe unease at the strength of a woman who had stood her ground against both the law and a mob. Her cookhouse door swung open once more, the smell of bread and coffee drifting into the street. The first days had been slow. Only a few came in, sitting with their hats clutched in their hands, speaking little. Then, one by one, the regulars returned, farmers, drovers, wives with baskets, some sliding coins across her counter without a word, others meeting her gaze and nodding as if to say they understood more than they could speak. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric dusted white with flour. She moved with the rhythm she thought she'd lost, kneading, pouring, serving. Yet each motion felt changed, steadier, as though the storm had carved something new in her bones. She carried the journal still, tucked away where her husband's memory could not be erased again, and from time to time, she'd press her hand against it just to feel its weight. Elias Kane stayed through the healing days, his presence like a shadow at the edge of her light. He worked when he could, mending a fence for a widow nearby, hauling barrels for the blacksmith. He bore his scars with silence, each movement slower than before but never weak. Some in town still looked at him with hunger for the reward that had been promised. But most had seen too much that night to believe Doolin's story anymore. They gave him space, wary but no longer circling like wolves. One dawn, before the sun had broken clean over the horizon, Clara heard hoofbeats out back. She stepped to the doorway, apron tied, lantern burning faint in the dim. Kane stood with his horse saddled, the animal's breath white in the chill air. His hat shadowed his face, but when he looked at her, his eyes were clear, calmer than the night he first bled on her floor. "You're leaving," she said softly. He gave the smallest nod. "Can't stay. Trouble follows me, and you've had enough of it." Her chest tightened, but she only gripped the doorway harder. "And if trouble finds you again?" He half smiled, the scar at his jaw tugging. "Then I hope I remember you were the one who made me think a man could be more than what folks called him. No promises, no vows, just the truth, raw and simple." He swung into the saddle, wincing faintly at the pull of his side, and turned the horse toward the open land. Clara's voice caught, but she forced the words free. Words she knew were for herself as much as him. Sometimes love comes like a storm, wild, unwanted, but if it leaves you stronger, maybe it was the only kind worth having. The hoofbeats carried him away, fading into the horizon, swallowed by the endless sweep of prairie. Clara stood long after he disappeared, the cool morning air filling her lungs. She turned back into her cookhouse, apron dusted, lantern steady, and the silence she carried now was not chains but choice. The town was different, and so was she. And as the sun finally lifted, washing the streets in gold, Clara Jameson knew the storm had passed, but its mark had made her unbreakable. This was the story of a gentle cook and a wild cowboy, a storm of love that changed everything. If you enjoyed the journey, like this video, comment your favorite moment and subscribe for more cinematic Western stories.